At 2:14 a.m. on August 20th, 1943, a lookout on the SS Fort Norman pressed his binoculars to his eyes and watched a torpedo wake glow in the dark water. It passed the stern, then it curved. The line of bubbles bent like a question mark and came back. The tanker had been running quiet, blacked out, following the stern light of the ship ahead. The engine room was a low throb beneath the deck. The convoy, 57 ships stretching across 3 miles of Atlantic, watched the impossible. A torpedo that could hear. It hit aft, below the engine room. The explosion lifted the stern clear of the water. Men who had been sleeping in their bunks woke up falling through darkness. The stern hung in the air for a second, then dropped. The ship broke in two. 12 minutes later, the Fort Norman was gone. Only 3 men survived. They were pulled from the water by a corvette that had been running search and rescue. One of them, a boy from Glasgow named McKinnon, kept saying the same thing. It turned. I saw it turn. In the escort destroyer HMS Itchen, Lieutenant James Rawlings had the headset on. He had been listening to the underwater phones, trying to hear the U-boat that fired. Instead, he heard something else, a high-pitched whine. It grew louder, then faded, then grew loud again. The torpedo was searching. It had a voice. It sang as it hunted. That night, 3 more ships went down the same way. The torpedoes came from outside the convoy perimeter, fired blind into the massive noise. Then they hunted on their own. They listened for propellers. They followed the sound of engines. They could hear the difference between a destroyer and a tanker. They picked the biggest noise and ran it down. The next morning, the survivors huddled in lifeboats. Bill Carter, the radio operator, had been on deck when the torpedo hit. He told the rescue crew he saw it miss, then turn back like a dog on a scent. The word spread through the fleet. In the officers' mess of every ship in the western approaches, they talked about it. In the crew quarters, they whispered. The sea had ears. Back in Liverpool, the Naval Intelligence Office on Rumford Street had been tracking the pattern for 3 weeks. 22 ships lost, all in the same way. A new weapon. The Germans called it the Zaunkönig, the wren, a small bird that followed the sound of other birds. The admirals sat around a table. Charts showed the losses in red ink. Each mark was a ship, a crew, a cargo of fuel or tanks or food that never made it to England. Admiral John Godfrey looked at the numbers and said, "They can hear us. Every propeller, every engine, we are screaming our position to them." In the merchant navy pups along the docks, the men talked. They called them listening torpedoes. Some refused to sail. Others demanded transfers to coastal runs. The sea had always been dangerous. Now it was intelligent. It hunted you. One captain, a man named Davies who had survived 3 sinkings, put it simply, "The water is against us now." On August 28th, another convoy left Halifax. 40 ships, 8 escorts. 4 days out, the U-boats found them. The new torpedoes came in at dusk. 5 ships sank. The escorts dropped depth charges, but the U-boats fired from outside the range, then went deep. The torpedoes did the rest. The escorts couldn't protect them. The weapons were too smart. The winter was coming. Britain needed every gallon of fuel, every ton of food. The convoys had to run. But the men who ran them were learning to fear the water itself. The sound of their own engines had become a death sentence. When a ship's engine coughed or missed, men would freeze. They were learning to listen to their own death. In a small office in the Admiralty building, a signal came in. It was marked Most Secret. It contained one sentence. Find a way to make our ship silent, or find a way to make the sea louder. The man who read it was Commander Peter Wykeham. He ran the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. They called his department the Weezers and Dodgers. They built strange things. Rocket launchers that fired from fishing boats, floating tanks. Now they needed something that could save the Atlantic. Wykeham looked at the paper. Then he looked at the map on his wall. Red pins marked each sinking. They formed a line across the ocean. A line of sound. A line of dying men. He picked up the phone. It was 4:30 p.m. on September 1st, 1943. The light outside his window was already fading. He dialed a number in a basement workshop in Portsmouth. A man answered. His name was Arthur Barber. He was an acoustic engineer. He had been working on sonar problems since 1940. He was 43 years old and had spent the war trying to hear the enemy. Wykeham said, "We need you here tomorrow. Bring your team. Bring every idea you've ever had about noise." Barber said, "What's the problem?" "The torpedoes can hear us," Wykeham said. "We need to teach them to hear something else." He hung up. Outside, the autumn light was almost gone. In the Atlantic, another convoy was forming up. Another group of men would soon be sailing into water that listened. Barber put the phone down and looked at his workshop. Pipes, wires, microphones, recorders. He had spent 3 years learning how to listen. Now he had to learn how to shout. Arthur Barber looked at the pipes and wires on his workbench. The phone was still warm in his hand. He had 3 engineers on his team. 2 were in the basement now soldering a hydrophone array. The third was a woman named Margaret who had been a piano tuner before the war. She could hear frequencies most people missed. Barber called her his golden ear. He walked downstairs. The basement smelled of ozone and hot metal. On the wall, they had pinned the German torpedo specifications, not the real ones. They had guessed most of it from the wreckage brought up from the seabed. A tail fin here, a magnetic pistol there, enough to know the torpedo listened for the high-pitched scream of a ship's propeller, around 24 kilohertz, the sound of cavitation, the sound of bubbles collapsing behind spinning blades. "Listen to me," Barber said to his team. "We can't make the ships quiet. They're too big, too much metal, too much water moving. We can't hide. So we need to make something louder, something that screams louder than a freighter." He picked up a wrench, tapped it against his steam pipe. The ring hung in the air for a second. "We need to make a sound that follows a ship, a sound that sings the same song, but sweeter, so the torpedo goes after it instead." Margaret closed her eyes. "The torpedo isn't smart. It's a dog. It follows the loudest scent. We need to make a false trail." They started with a gramophone, rigged it to play a recording of engine noise through an underwater speaker. They towed it behind a launch in Portsmouth Harbor. The hydrophone picked it up clear as day. But the recording was too regular. Real engines hiccuped. They missed. They changed pitch with the waves. "We need something mechanical," Barber said, "something real." They tried 2 steel bars, just flat bars, 6 inches long. They rigged them to a small motor that made them slap together. The sound underwater was brutal, a metallic chatter that cut through everything. They recorded it. Margaret listened. Too sharp, too artificial. They added rubber washers. The sound dulled. They tried different metals. Brass screamed, iron hummed. Steel gave them the right mix. They added a second pair, slightly different length. The frequencies overlapped. The sound became messy, real. "We need to drag this behind the ship," Barber said, "but it has to be far enough back that the torpedo doesn't miss and hit the ship anyway." They designed a towed body, a metal fish 6 feet long with the noisemakers inside. It would plane through the water behind the ship 200 yards back. The tow cable would vibrate and add its own sound. The whole thing would be a floating scream. Wycombe came down to the workshop on September 12th. He looked at the prototype. "Is it ready?" "No," Barber said, "but it will be." "How soon?" 2 weeks. Wycombe looked at the calendar on the wall. September 12th. The next major convoy sailed October 1st. "You have 10 days. We've lost 30,000 tons this week. The Americans are screaming. The Russians are starving. We need this now." Barber worked through the nights. His team lived on tea and cigarettes. They tested variations in the tank behind the lab, a concrete pool where they could control the sound. They recorded the torpedo frequencies over and over. They learned to sing the same song. They called it the Foxer. No one remembered why. Someone said it sounded like foxes barking underwater. Someone else said it was because it outfoxed the Germans. The name stuck. By September 22nd, they had 12 units. They weren't pretty. Welded steel, painted gray, with a single tow point and a cable that looked too thin. Inside each one, 2 pairs of steel bars slapped together at 3,000 revolutions per minute. The sound was awful. It made your teeth hurt if you stood too close to the tank. They loaded them onto a corvette, HMS Mandrake, for testing. The corvette captain was a young man named Harris. He had lost his last ship to a listening torpedo. 40 men dead. He looked at the Foxer and said, "This is it." "This is it," Barber said. "And if it doesn't work, then we try something else." They sailed out into the Irish Sea. A clear day, flat water. Harris accelerated to convoy speed, 12 knots. They deployed the Foxer. It ran true behind the ship, bouncing on the surface, the cable humming. Barber lowered a hydrophone. The sound was perfect. A wall of noise. 20 kilohertz up to 30. It warbled. It changed. It sounded exactly like a ship's propeller, but brighter, more focused. They sent the recording to the listening station at Larne. The operator called back. "Which ship is that? I can hear you clear as day." Barber smiled. "We're the only ship here." He hung up. Harris was watching him. "Will it fool a torpedo?" Barber looked at the water. It fooled a man. They tested it against a real torpedo on September 28th, an old Mark 8 without a warhead, rigged to run acoustic. They fired it from a submarine at 2 miles. The corvette ran with the Foxer deployed. The torpedo came in straight, then at the last moment, it veered. It passed 30 yards astern. It circled back. It followed the Foxer for 3 minutes before running out of fuel. Barber watched through binoculars. He didn't cheer. He just wrote in his notebook, "It works." Wycombe got the report at 4 p.m. that afternoon. He called Churchill's office. The Prime Minister was eating lunch. He took the call. Wycombe read the test results. Churchill was silent for a moment. Then he said, "How many can you build?" "1 a day with the current shop, more if we subcontract." "Build them all. Every escort ship, every merchantman that can tow one, yesterday." The orders went out on September 30th. The drawings went to 12 workshops around Britain: Birmingham, Glasgow, Manchester. They were simple enough that any machine shop could build them. 2 steel bars, a small motor, a towed body. Cheap, quick. The first production Foxer was loaded onto a destroyer at Liverpool on October 3rd. The ship was HMS Bickerton. It was escorting convoy ON 206. 48 ships. The captain had the Foxer deployed within an hour of clearing the harbor. That night, the U-boats found them. 3 torpedoes were fired. All 3 went after the Foxer. All 3 missed. The destroyer's lookout watched the wakes pass astern. He reported them as misses. But they weren't misses. They were successes. The convoy sailed on. The ships behind the Bickertons saw the device in the water. They asked what it was. The signal flags read, "New anti-torpedo device. Do not report, do not discuss." In the engine rooms of the freighters, the engineers listened to the Foxer's chatter through the hull. It sounded like a second engine, running just out of sync. The men didn't know what it was. They just knew the water felt safer. Barber got the signal on October 5th. Convoy on 206 unmolested. He sat in his chair and stared at the wall. Then he put his head in his hands. His team stood around him, waiting. He looked up. His eyes were red. "We did it," he said. "Now we need to do it 1,000 more times." Barber's team started the next morning at 5 a.m. The phone didn't stop ringing. Workshops in Birmingham wanted specs for the motor. A shipyard in Glasgow needed the cable design. The Royal Navy Supply Office asked how many they could build in a week. Barber's answer was always the same: as many as you need. By October 10th, the Admiralty had ordered 500 Foxers. The workshops worked in shifts. The noise was constant, metal on metal. The same sound they were building, but in the air. Margaret left the lab for the first time in 3 days to get more tea. She saw the autumn sun and stopped. She couldn't remember what day it was. The first full convoy to carry Foxers on every ship was HX 265. It left Halifax on October 15th, 1943. 54 ships. Each one towed a Foxer behind the stern. The water behind the convoy sounded like a factory, a wall of chatter that stretched 3 miles. The U-boats detected them on October 19th. They tracked the convoy for 2 days. They fired 9 torpedoes. All 9 missed. The U-boat captains reported back to Courneval, the U-boat command center in France. They said the convoy was using a new device, something that made false sounds. The reports were confused. Some said the Allies were using submarines as decoys. Others thought they had developed a new propeller design. Admiral Donitz read the reports and threw them across the room. He had lost 20 torpedoes in the week. Each one cost more than a house. Each one was supposed to win the war. On November 3rd, a destroyer named HMS Wrestler took a direct hit, not from a torpedo, from a mine. The explosion broke the ship's back. She was sinking slowly. The crew abandoned ship. The destroyer stayed afloat for 6 hours, wallowing in the swell. The Foxer was still deployed, still running, still singing its mechanical song. A U-boat found the wreck. It fired a Zaunkönig at the hulk. The torpedo ran straight, then veered. It followed the Foxer sound. It hit the empty destroyer. The ship rolled over and went down. The U-boat captain reported a confirmed kill. The Admiralty read the signal and smiled. The Foxer had fooled them even after the ship was dead. In the engine room of the troop ship SS Monarch of Bermuda, a greaser named Naomi Yates felt the vibration through the deck plates. He had sailed on 3 convoys. He had seen 2 ships sink. Now he heard this new sound, a constant chatter from behind the ship. He asked the chief engineer what it was. "Something the Boffins built," the chief said. "It talks to the torpedoes, tells them lies." Yates listened to the sound every night for 3 weeks. He got used to it. Then, on November 22nd, the sound stopped. The motor in the Foxer had seized. The chief called the bridge. The captain reduced speed to 8 knots. They were in the central Atlantic, the black pit where the U-boats waited. Every man on board listened to the silence. 3 hours later, a torpedo wake appeared. It came from starboard, running fast. There was no Foxer to confuse it. The lookout shouted. The helmsman turned hard to port. The torpedo hit forward, near the chain locker. The explosion tore a hole in the hull. The ship didn't sink, but 6 men died. The next morning, they repaired the Foxer in the water. A sailor went over the side in a harness, waves breaking over him, and replaced the motor. The chatter started again. Yates listened to it and felt the fear go away. The Germans tried to adapt. They modified the Zaunkönig to listen for 2 frequencies at once, the Foxer and the ship. But the Foxer was too close behind. The torpedo couldn't separate the sounds. It always chose the nearer one. The Germans built a new version that listened for the gap between sounds. The British added a second Foxer, then a third. The noise became a wall. The sea itself seemed to scream. In December, the Foxers started to fail. The motors burned out. The steel bars cracked from the constant hammering. The tow cables parted in heavy seas. Ships sailed without them, gambling. Some won, some didn't. The Royal Navy set up repair ships at Gibraltar, at Reykjavik, at St. John's. They carried spare motors, spare bars, miles of cable. The crews learned to fix them at sea, in the dark, with torpedoes in the water. Barber visited one of the repair ships in Liverpool Harbor on December 14th. It was a trawler converted to a floating workshop. The deck was covered with Foxers in pieces. A young rating was filing down a steel bar, sparks flying. Barber asked him how many he had fixed. The rating didn't look up. 73, sir. 3 today. Do they all work? Mostly. Some get bent when the ship turns too fast. Some just wear out. It's the salt, see? Gets in the motor. Barber watched the man work. He had never met the people who used his device. He had never seen the ocean where they used it. He had spent the war in basements, listening to recordings. "Thank you," Barber said. The rating looked up, surprised. "For what, sir?" "For keeping them talking." On Christmas Eve, 1943, convoy JW-55B left Scotland for Russia. The sea was black and hard. The Foxers froze solid on the first night. Crewmen had to chip the ice off with hammers. The temperature was 20 below. The motors labored, but they ran. The convoy got through. Not one ship lost. In Murmansk, the Russian dock workers heard the strange sound and asked what it was. The British sailors just smiled. They called it their Christmas music. The signal from Murmansk reached Barber's office on New Year's Day, 1944. He read it twice. Then he looked at the map. The red pins had stopped spreading. The line of sinkings that started in August was holding steady. The Foxers were working. But the phone rang. It was Wycombe. "The Germans have captured one," Wycombe said. "A destroyer in the channel. It went aground near Cherbourg. They got the Foxer before we could sink it." Barber felt his stomach drop. "How long ago?" 3 days. They're taking it apart in Kiel right now." In Kiel, in a warehouse by the submarine pens, a German engineer named Klaus Richter was listening to a recording. The British device had been pulled apart on a bench. 2 steel bars, a small electric motor, a shape like a fish. It seemed too simple, but the recording from the tracking station told the truth. The Foxer made a wall of sound. The Zaunkönig couldn't hear past it. Richter's boss, a man named Gruber, stood behind him. "Can you fix it?" "Fix the torpedo? Yes, but it will take time." "We don't have time. Donitz wants a solution in 2 weeks." Richter played the recording again. He could hear the pattern. The Foxer made noise at fixed frequencies, 24 kilohertz, then a gap, then 26. It hammered the water. The Zaunkönig listened for the gap between sounds, the silence that meant a real ship. The Foxer gave it no silence. "We need to make the torpedo smarter," Richter said. "It must listen for the difference between real propeller noise and fake. The real noise has harmonics. The false one is too regular. Then build that. It needs a new circuit, new hydrophones. We need 3 months. You have 1. Richter worked 20-hour days. He took the Zaunkönig apart. He rebuilt the listening head. He added filters. He made it hear the subtlety. But every week, the British reports showed the Foxers were still working. The sinking stayed low. In February, the Americans started building their own version. They called it the FXR. It was louder, rougher. It chewed through motors twice as fast, but worked just as well. In the North Atlantic, convoy HX-280 left New York on February 22nd. Every ship had a Foxer. The escorts had two. The water behind the convoy sounded like a city. The U-boats tracked them for 3 days. They fired 12 torpedoes. All 12 went after the Foxers. The convoy sailed on. Aboard U-548, the captain, a man named Gunter, watched through his periscope. He had fired 2 Zaunkonigs. Both had missed. He listened to the hydrophone operator. "It sounds like 50 ships," the operator said. "I can't tell which is real." Gunter raised the periscope again. He could see the convoy, count the masts, 30 ships, but the water sounded like 100. He had been at sea for 60 days. He had 1 torpedo left. He decided to wait for night, to surface, to use his deck gun on the stragglers. But the escorts were too many. He watched the convoy sail away. He radioed Carnival. "Foxer makes acoustic torpedoes useless. Request new orders." By March 1944, the Admiralty stopped counting successes. They just counted failures. A Foxer broke down. A ship was hit. It was that simple. In the repair shops, the men worked faster. They built motors that could be swapped in 10 minutes. They made steel bars from scrap. They used parts from downed aircraft. Barber visited Portsmouth on March 15th. A destroyer was in dry dock. The Foxer had been hauled up. The steel bars were worn to half their length. The engineer showed him. "We ran it for 200 hours straight. It just wore out. Are you complaining?" "No, sir. I'm impressed. We just need more bars." Build them from anything. Old tank tracks, bomb casings, just keep them talking. On April 4th, a Liberty ship named SS John H.B. Latrobe was torpedoed. The Foxer had been deployed, but the cable parted in a gale. The torpedo was a standard G7A, not acoustic. It ran straight and hit the boiler room. The ship sank in 20 minutes. 30 men died. The survivors were picked up by a corvette. One of them, a seaman named Andy, asked the corvette's captain why the Foxer hadn't worked. "It wasn't listening to the sound," the captain said. "It was blind." Andy looked at the empty water. "We need protection from the deaf ones, too." The captain nodded. "We're working on that." By May, the Zaunkönig had been withdrawn from service. Donitz ordered his captains back to straight-running torpedoes. The acoustic dream was over. The British had outnoised them. The Atlantic War had become a shouting match, and the Allies had the louder voice. On May 15, 1944, a signal went out to all escort groups: Foxer deployment mandatory. The device became as standard as depth charges. The workshops produced 3,000 by June. They were shipped to the Pacific, to the Mediterranean, to the Arctic runs. In a bar in Liverpool, on the last day of May, Tommy Yates from the Monarchas Bermuda bought a drink for a man he didn't know. The man wore a tweed jacket. He looked tired. Yates said, "You sound like a boffin." The man was Arthur Barber. He was in town to see the loading docks. "I am," Barber said. "You build those noisemakers?" "I did." Yates raised his glass. "Then here's to you. The water doesn't scare me anymore." Barber looked at his drink. He thought about the men who had drowned while the Foxer was still a drawing. He thought about the steel bars, hammering themselves to pieces in the dark. "The water still scares me," he said. "It just doesn't listen to them anymore." Barber left the bar at midnight. The streets were dark. Liverpool was blacked out, but he could hear ships loading at the docks. Winches, cargo nets, men calling to each other in the dark. The whole city sounded like a convoy getting ready to sail. He walked back to his hotel. A boy in a uniform too big for him stopped him on the corner. "You the man who made the Foxer?" the boy asked. "I am," Barber said. "My brother's on a tank landing craft. They put one of your things on it yesterday. He wrote me, said it sounds like 2 cats fighting in a bathtub." Barber smiled. "Tell him to keep it running." "I will, sir." The boy saluted and ran off. Barber watched him go. Then he looked up at the sky. No stars, just cloud. Somewhere out there, the invasion fleet was assembling. 5,000 ships. Every one of them would need a Foxer. He had been in meetings all week. The Admiralty wanted 10,000 units by June. They had 7. The gap was 3,000. He would need more workshops, more steel, more men who could work through the night. On May 28, 1944, the first landing ships left the Solent. They moved in columns, slow and heavy. Each LST towed a Foxer behind the stern ramp. The device bounced in the chop, throwing spray. The engineers on board hated the noise. It made the whole hull ring. But the captains kept them running. They had been briefed. The Germans had moved U-boats to the French coast. They were waiting for this. In Portsmouth, Barber stood on the deck of a transport ship. He watched a crew lower a Foxer into the water. The cable paid out, the motor started, the chatter began. A seaman nearby put his fingers in his ears. "How long can it run?" the seaman shouted. 200 hours, Barber shouted back. "Then what?" "Then you fix it." The seaman nodded. He looked at the device trailing behind the ship. "It's ugly." "It is." "But it works?" "It works." The fleet assembled off Beachy Head, ships as far as you could see. Destroyers wove between them, dropping depth charges on every contact. The Foxers made the water sound like a highway. The hydrophone operators on the escorts couldn't hear anything else. They were deaf to the U-boats. But the U-boats were deaf to them too. On June 5th, the weather turned bad. Eisenhower postponed the invasion. The fleet rode at anchor. The Foxers ran. They ran all night. The motors burned out by the dozens. Repair boats moved through the fleet like taxis, swapping motors, replacing bars. Barber was on one of them. He climbed onto a landing craft at 3 a.m. The deck was slick with vomit. The sea was rough. "Can you fix it?" the captain asked. Barber looked at the Foxer. The motor housing was cracked. He pulled it out. The rating behind him handed him a new one. They had practiced this. 10 minutes. The new motor went in. The Foxer started again. The chatter returned. "Good luck tomorrow," Barber said. The captain looked at the beach they couldn't see yet. "We won't need luck. We have noise." On June 6th at 5:30 a.m., the fleet moved toward Normandy. The Foxers ran. The water behind each ship screamed. At 6 a.m., a U-boat fired 3 torpedoes at a group of landing ships off Omaha Beach. The torpedoes ran straight for 2 minutes. Then they curved. They followed the Foxers. They exploded in empty water. The landing ships sailed on. The men on board didn't even know they had been targeted. By noon, the beaches were taken. The ships in the transport area kept their Foxers running. They had to stay all day. Unload, reload. The U-boats kept firing. 22 torpedoes were launched at the invasion fleet on D-Day. All 22 missed. The German radio traffic was frantic. Their torpedoes couldn't find targets. The fleet was invisible behind a wall of sound. In Berlin, Donitz received the report. He read it twice. Then he called his chief engineer. "The British have won the sound war. Stop production on the Zaunkönig. Use the steel for tanks." The engineer asked what would protect the U-boats. "Nothing," Donitz said. "They must now fight with knives." Barber heard the news on June 10th. He was back in his basement office. The signal was one line. D-Day fleet suffered 0 acoustic torpedo hits. He sat down. He looked at the wall where they had first hung the German torpedo specs. The paper was yellow now. The war had moved on. A messenger brought him a cup of tea. He left it on the desk. It got cold. The war ended 11 months later. Barber was in Portsmouth, watching a shipyard crane lift a Foxer out of the water. The device was rusted. The steel bars were worn to stubs. It had been in the water for 9 months straight. The captain of the ship stood next to him. "Do we keep it?" the captain asked. "No," Barber said. "You don't need it anymore." "What do I do with it?" "Throw it away." The Foxer was lifted onto the dock. A workman looked at it, then kicked it. It rang like a bell. Then he picked it up and carried it to a scrap pile. It landed on top of other Foxers, all rusted, all silent, a mountain of noisemakers that had become quiet. Barber walked away. He went down to the water. The tide was out. The mud smelled of salt and oil. He took off his shoes and stood at the edge. The sea was flat. He could hear a ship's propeller in the distance, a single freighter leaving harbor. He could hear the real sound. No Foxer to hide it, no torpedo to hunt it, just a ship going somewhere. He listened for a long time. Then he turned and walked back to the city. Behind him, the water was quiet.